Hey y'all, this is Damn It Don from DGG, and I just wanted to take a minute to do a quick introduction on this first development diary that I'm working on for the Marionette. Uh, I've been thinking about this species for quite a long time. It's an interesting race slash species of that I developed for D&D, and I wanted to take a minute and talk about where the inspiration came from. So, a little bit of backstory from me. Uh, I even as a kid, I watched a lot of really interesting shows. One of the ones that stood out to me was Velveteen Rabbit, and even more notoriously so, Child's Play. And the idea's always kind of been in the back of my head. Hey, what about creating a playable race or a playable species of these these created materials, like these constructs, these little toys and dolls that kids have, and let's turn that into something that you could play in an RPG. So imagine, for instance, this doll, this companion doll that this little girl has, and this little girl this doll is all this little girl has as far as, a friend, somebody who comforts her at all times, and that kind of love eventually ignites a small spark of life inside that doll. And it could even be decades or years after that person has long since discarded or passed them on. And so this companion doll awakens, and they still have that drive to need to connect, and they're looking for their owner, or their owner's still alive and there's a problem and their owner really needs help. There's all of these really interesting story hooks that we can create from just having a marionette character in a party. And so I really just I like the idea of kind of like that Toy Story style. You have these toys that were designed for a specific person to bring joy to these kids, or bring joy as like a show puppet. Think kind of like Pinocchio, where a true marionette that has strings was created for a show to like perform, to be the center of attention, to bring smiles on people's faces, and those drives are still innately ingrained in these marionettes when they awaken. And so that can create some interesting party dynamics as well. So I took the time and really spent a lot of extra time on my behalf and some of my players, to their chagrin, to test out the system specs on this. And we came up with three major subtypes. So there's a big bunch of fluff that that I'm working on. Like, for instance, we can go in here and say it can be brought to life in many ways, but the situations are awfully similar, or oftentimes similar. Like, for instance, this imprinted bond of an owner of a marionette projects a powerful emotions into it. This happens when a person, usually a young child who is lonely, bonds with a marionette, and it uses it as a prop for, an imaginary friend. And it also talks about how sometimes celestial or abyssal beings can also reanimate these marionettes to bring forth some kind of change in the world that they have plans for. And then it talks about how it could be traumatic to become alive. Like, think about it. You're all of a sudden thrust into this world that you have to grow and adapt to survive in. That's not an easy thing to do. So, it's really easy for these marionettes to be naive to deception and emotional manipulation. They're going to have a hard time understanding emotional and social nuances. They can seem to be almost childlike in social graces. Like, they make mistakes. They might call somebody, a name, and not realize that that's a problem because it's a descriptor. Like, hey, short person, and this person might have a serious short person complex, and that's upsetting and can cause a really interesting time when the party's trying to negotiate with nobles and diplomats. So that's what I really wanted to bring in at this first little dev thing and talk about. A couple of the general bonuses, like here's a couple of interesting playtester names that we had for some of the marionettes, like Abernathy, Braxis the Bouncer. Braxis the Bouncer was actually a stuffed round, spherical, almost like a beholder kind of stuffed creature. Anyways, that kind of thing. Then you have the normal ability score increase for every marionette is a constitution score increase by 1. And one thing I put in here is that it isn't apparent that age affects marionettes in many ways. It's likely that most of them fall to the harsh violence in the world, so it's really hard, and they're so rare that when they are found, they're usually only found between 1 and 10 years old after their point of being awakened. They're small-sized, obviously, because, like I said, they're either like marionette-sized or dolls or a large stuffed guardian kind of like stuffed animal that could be packed with rice or grain. That's why, the weight could be between 8 to 30 pounds. And I kept the tiny person speed of 25 because we needed to do some balancing in the game, and they're not speedy or hyper flexible. However, in some of the subtypes you'll see that's not entirely always the case. They get the standard construct bonuses. False appearance. This is kind of inspired by Toy Story or that kind of thing, where when they go into a long rest, they're indistinguishable from another doll or stuffed animal. They just appear like they're just another, accoutrement that's sitting around in the camp. However, like it says here, moving or shifting from that stationary position during a long rest will cancel the effects of a long rest. That essential spark that is burning and creating that fire inside this marionette, it needs time to recharge after it's been used, so being absolutely stationary in kind of that hibernation state is super important. Also, I wanted marionettes to be a little bit different. Their dark vision is almost like a form of preternatural vision, where they can sense in grayscale the things around them, even in absolute dark. So, for flavor purposes, that's why they have dark vision. Then each independent subtype of marionette also has its own form of natural armor. Like, companion dolls, kind of the middle of the road, they get a 15 plus dex modifier with a maximum of 3, but that's because they're made of cloth, joints, wood, and oftentimes dense porcelain around the major body parts. Show puppets with hinges and wood and leather coverings are built to last for years, but they're more flexible than durable. Think of these as your marionettes, or like when a merchant caravan comes in and all of the kids gather around this little stage and the show puppets show up. So they're going to be flexible and kind of the center of attention. Stuffed guardians are heavily stitched and built for commoner children to abuse. So they basically have heavy armor. They're not super flexible. They're very dense. They have disadvantage on self checks because they kind of lumber around. That sort of thing. And then you get into some of the advanced things that marionettes get, such as essence hardening. Basically, because they have their own calculated armor class, as shown up here, they don't get traditional AC bonuses from like magical armor and magical shields. Instead, they get a +1 at 5th, 11th, and 16th level to kind of account for that essence that's, it's taking deeper roots into the vessel and becoming more alive, and that magic is enchanting the materials themselves to become a lot stronger. However, just because you don't get the bonus doesn't mean you can't benefit from magical armor and shields. You can bond with a single piece of armor or shield, and when you do that, you can impart yourself with some of those properties. So, for instance, if a magical set of chainmail has resistance to cold, you can bond with it and get that cold resist still. And this is a balancing mechanic too, so that marionette players, when they're playing their marionette characters, don't feel like they're getting the raw deal, even though they get this natural AC bonus, they don't get the neat magic items thing. So this is kind of that happy medium. And because marionettes are constructed out of, all of these materials that can burn, they're flammable, so if they ignite, they take a d6 fire damage until an action by somebody or themselves extinguishes the fire, just like normal igniting flammable rules. And they can only speak, read, and write common. I would say that you could probably talk to your DM, and if you have a child or an owner that speaks an exotic language, they could probably tack that on there too. But I wanted to keep this really basic because they're just awakening in the world. So there are 3 different kinds of subspecies. The companion doll, like I said, like the porcelain-faced baby dolls and such that are really, they awaken after long years or what have you, and they really are the most emotionally empathetic of the marionette types. And it's the hardest for the companion dolls to deal with a new life that they find themselves trying to live. And then there's a list of interesting personality traits that kind of root themselves in that, like one of the interesting ones was, I struggle to remember that I'm no longer the child, that my life is now my beloved doll, because in some cases, the owner transfers their essence into their beloved doll. Think kind of like Child's Play, but not necessarily as homicidal. But, and then there's things like this, where you have, I have to undo that, but I no longer trust children. They all grow old and leave. I mean, so you got to think about the trauma and the feeling that these creations feel when they awake, depending on their circumstances. They can be wholesome, but they can also be tragic. So there's a lot of interesting, personality traits that I have wrapped up in here. And I'll go into more detail about each one with another diary. I just wanted to give you all a heads up on what I've been working on and what to expect coming down the pipeline. I will be releasing the Marionette Species for free through the DGG website. I'll post a link in social media, and I'll probably post a link in the description of this, as well as other dev diaries as it's being developed. Once it's as it's completely developed. So, with that being said, there is going to be a published adventure that's coming out that won't be for free, but I will be live recording me and some players as I DM the Menagerie of Souls. It's an introductory 1st to 3rd level adventure, specifically for a party of marionettes. And it's kind of like Toy Story meets a creepy carnival kind of atmosphere. I think if you're in for a good story that's got some gothic undertones, has a lot of inspirational moments and some deep emotional connections between the NPCs and the characters as they play through this, then you'll be in for a really good time. I'm not going to go into some heavy detail with it because it's still in a lot of development, and once it's rolling, I want some of those surprises to remain surprises until the recordings are done and they're published. Anywho, that's it for me, Don at DGG. If you like what we're doing, think it's interesting, comment, subscribe. We'll do our best to respond to you as soon as we can. We're getting things up and rolling. We've already got some decent patrons. I want to give an awesome shout out to those legendary few that are really, really pushing us to move forward. Shout out to George and Colby for kicking some serious butt and supporting us and getting us to start moving even faster and really, really taking the time to dive deep and try to balance all of these things. That way it's better content for everybody, and we're just here to have a great time and enjoy things. So, with that being said, stay legendary, folks. Stay legendary.